Long gone are the days when made in India was something that global consumers turn up their noses at. Today, Indian products stand for purity and very much keeping with the trend of 100% organic. In fact, not just the products, our cultural practices like yoga and traditional therapies like Ayurveda are also finding a resurgence across the globe.
They sure are, Ankit. In fact, we're observing the global rise of brand India. And to explore the tremendous climb, we've reached out to a well-known brand pundit, eminent British business personality and founder and executive at S4 Capital and founder of WPP as well, Sir Martin Sorrell. So please welcome him with a loud round of applause. He's going to be in conversation with senior editor Times Network, Sonali Krishna.
Well, whether you give me or Mr. Martin Sorrell an applause at the moment, I'm pretty sure by the end of the session it will be a roaring applause, because this man does not mince his words. He's as candid as it gets and says it as it is. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am super excited to be interviewing Sir Martin Sorrell, a man I've interviewed for 12 years, and each time I interview him, it just gets more exciting. So happy to have you with us at the India Economic Conclave, Martin. Truly a pleasure.
Thank you, Sonali. I'm delighted to be with you virtually, if not physically. I wish it was with you in person, but hopefully in very short order. And I won't mention, well, as long as we don't talk about cricket.
I'm going to abstain from cricket because I'm not a cricket fan, but I know you are. But having said that, let me deep dive, because I have plenty of questions and very less time. It's been a harrowing 2 years for all of us. And just when we thought the worst was behind us, we have a war at hand. What's your outlook for 2022?
Well, Sonali, if we were talking about this sort of 90 days ago, we probably would have had a very different perspective to what we have now. Obviously, when we looked at, so let me jog back to 3 months ago. When we're coming into this year, we were looking at worldwide GDP growth in the 4 to 5 range. After last year, 5 to 6. You mentioned 2 harrowing years, and it was 2 harrowing years. But the silver lining, if there was any silver lining from COVID and its variants, was that the massive fiscal and monetary stimulus that we saw on the worldwide stage. If the world is around $85–90 trillion, we probably saw about $10 to $15 trillion pumped into the world economy in various fiscal and monetary measures. And we saw the rebound in 21, which surprised people to the upside. And we were going into 22 thinking we see a continuation. So last year, 5 to 6% GDP growth. This year, 4 to 5. Where are we after the first quarter? Well, growth estimates because of the war, but before that, because of the rise in inflation and the change in government policy from worrying about employment as a result of COVID to worrying about inflation as a result of COVID and its impact on supply chains. So we had rising interest rates as a result of it. And of course, in the last 24 hours, the Fed has signaled probably that rates might even rise faster than the market's being pricing it in. Instead of 50 basis point hikes, you might even see 75 basis point hikes. So we have inflation, we have fiscal and monetary stimulus being withdrawn. We have also the war, which I think changes the calculus very significantly. I don't want to distract from the very bullish, optimistic ITC analysis of the Indian economy and by implication the worldwide economy. I don't want to distract. I don't want to spread gloom and doom. But I do think we have to be realistic about it. And I think the calculus has shifted markedly as a result of the war. And just let me expand a little bit on that. Sure. In financial terms, people talk about risk on and risk off. I think as a result of the war in Ukraine and the despicable things that are going on there, totally unacceptable actions that are going on there. As a result of that, it really is risk off in Central Eastern Europe. Businesses that thought about supply chains there, thought about activities there. I think in the short to medium term, absence of regime change, and even if you had a regime change in Russia, you're not guaranteed that the new regime would be any different to the old. So unless there was a substantial change in policy and change, I see continued nervousness and insecurity in Central Eastern Europe. So it's risk off there. As far as Asia is concerned, I would have, and it's really, to some extent, inappropriate to sort of talk about the war and the impact of war on economies, but I will do so for the sake of what we're talking about. I would have said it was risk on as far as Asia Pacific is concerned, maybe with the exception of China, because there are concerns that what happened in Ukraine may be a prelude to what might happen in Asia. I doubt whether anything will happen in front of the Congress in China in November, but President Xi, in my view, will get his elongation of his term to 2035. Vladimir Putin is probably going to be in place, subject to other events, until to 2035. So those two leaders, they may not have gone to COP26 in Glasgow, but they are the two world leaders probably be in place for the longest period of time. And I think Asia Pacific is risk on. So I think it's good news from an Indian point of view. It's good news from an Indonesian, Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Philippines, Thailand. All these countries will benefit in a sense from the increased insecurities and concerns about security. So I would say risk on for Asia, but with a big question mark on China. Russia is a $1.5 trillion economy. The world, as I said, is 85, 90 trillion. China is a very different kettle of fish. It's 14 trillion currently. It's the world's second largest economy. If there were issues around Taiwan, which resulted in sanctions or pressure on the Chinese economy, it's a very different, it's much far more integrated in the world economy, despite grain and minerals, than the Russian economy, and therefore the economic effects are much more severe. So generally risk on in Asia, but question mark over China. And I think businesses will be questioning increasingly their expansion in China, given the lack of relationship between the US and China, and that likely continue. Risk on in the Middle East, huge transfer of wealth as a result of energy prices rising, $100 oil price, and we've already seen it in the Middle East in the last couple of months. Significant surge in activity there. A lot of people moving, for example, to Dubai, both from Russia and from Hong Kong. So I would say Middle East risk on, Africa risk on, but obviously the challenges, the infrastructure challenges and political challenges in Africa are significant, apart from issues around corruption in some markets. And so therefore, I would say more difficult. But the area to me that is going to benefit the most from an economic point of view would be North and South America. Same time zone. You're going to see very significant nearshore, offshore opportunities. We're already seeing in our business, which is purely digital business, a shift in focus from Central and Eastern Europe to South America. So countries such as Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, those I pick out those four in particular, will benefit, I think, see very, very strong, and just like India, very strong in technology capabilities and people capabilities. And in the case of South America, very strong in creative, which is another part, two parts of our business, creative and technology. That region of the world, apart from the size of the population, the quality from a human point of view, human capital point of view, is significant. So I would say, and then just one other thing, Sonali, when people talk about defense budgets, the Germans, for the first time since World War II, will now be spending significant amounts of GDP, up to 40%, on defense. The definition of defense is not just military personnel, military capability, missiles, tanks, etc. It's also about technology. And I think one of the other result from this war, apart from that geographical pattern that I was talking about there, I think the other thing is that technology companies become much more important. Strong technology companies and a strong technological infrastructure around them, which obviously has very significant implications for India, given its strength in technology, they become more and more important. So the definition of defense includes cyber and technology, and therefore the big tech companies, the big six, the three Western platforms, so Google or Alphabet, Meta or Facebook, and Amazon, plus Alibaba, Tencent, and TikTok, ByteDance, become more and more significant. And therefore, I think the regulatory pressure probably diminishes over time. I'm not saying that they will be allowed to acquire significantly, but the influence of the technology companies will be heightened by the emphasis in government budgets on defense.
Right. I want to zone in a little bit on India. But before that, yeah. Martin, self-perception is always a little biased. I'd like an outside-in look at how the world looks at India, how the world looks at brand India, what's working for us, what's not. And given that you've always been a big propagator of India, of this market, you've been a big bettor, an early investor, much before the world woke up to India's potential. No better person than you to give me a candid view on what are the opportunities for India which we can seize in this decade, and of course the challenges that we definitely have to work out to ensure that we grasp that opportunity.
Well, I think brand India is very strong. I think it's stronger over the last years, particularly under Prime Minister Modi's leadership. And I think, no, look, there are criticisms. I think obviously the current situation in relation to the war, which we just discussed, and India's position on the war. I mean, there was condemnation of the atrocities in Bucha, but beyond that, India has maintained a neutral position. And of course, that does raise issues if there were to be secondary sanctions in relation to Russia at some point in time. India is purchasing oil from Russia at significantly lower prices than the market, and I think that does raise issues. But putting that aside, and then certain other political issues aside, I would say if you were looking at in the round in general, brand India is extremely strong and will continue to be. And under, I think, Modi's leadership, has gained significant ground. You know, our own Prime Minister, who has some issues to deal with at home currently, is in I think Delhi as we speak. Yes. Certainly has been in Gujarat as we would have spoken yesterday. So you know, that is indicative, and his mission is to develop a free trade agreement, which we badly needed the UK post Brexit. We need free trade agreements with everybody, but and maybe there will be a deal in relation to visas and visa applications for the strong Indian talent that we know very well in my well, 3 lives actually in the advertising business, both at Saatchi's and WPP and now S4. All cases we have very strong and growing Indian businesses, and we have great admiration and respect for the quality of the people there, and we're looking and for the quality of Indian entrepreneurs. Some of the leading Indian entrepreneurs rank as strongly as India has its equivalent to Elon Musk, as you well know. So I would say I remain extremely bullish, and if one looks to the future, I think that India's position will continue to strengthen. But the one issue, and I was thinking about it this morning in preparation for this. Sure. The world has changed. I think, as I'm trying to get over to you, I think the last, I started in the advertising business way back in '85. So, been at it really in that sense for about certainly, 35, 40 years. It goes beyond 85, actually. So a long time. We've benefited from free trade, which started probably in the 70s, 1970s and 80s. We benefited from, unrestricted access. I think the world has changed. I mean, Larry Finker's written about the end of globalization. I don't think it's the end in the Theodore Ted Levitt sense in 1983 in the Harvard Business Review, that consumers will consume everything in the same way everywhere. It hasn't ended, but that era of free trade and international expansion, I think we will see more fragmentation. We will see more regionalization, more focus on countries. I have to say, Sonali, that the idea that the West or developed countries will develop their own basic manufacturing capabilities, I think is nonsense. In an inflationary environment such as we're expecting now, nearshoring and offshoring will become more important. That's the big opportunity for Asia Pacific. It's the big opportunity for the Middle East and Africa. It's the big opportunity for South America. We're seeing it, as I said before, to an intense degree. But basically, the world is probably going to split into camps. And one of the issues for India, I think, in the longer term is, who do they align with? Do they align with a Russian-Chinese axis? Or do they align more with a Western axis? Or indeed, do they choose to try and benefit from both? And I think that is, when you think about trying to run a business, a global business, we're in 33 countries. We're 70% North and South America, 20% EMEA, and 10% Asia Pacific. Our objective is to be 40-20-40. But as a result of the war and that increased security issue, I think it would be realistic to assume it would be something like 60-20-20. And it would be, I think, more difficult to expand significantly or as fast as we would have liked, given the security issues that have been raised by the current war. And you're thinking about it just for a minute. Wait, one other point. Let's assume for a minute there was some form of what observers call bad peace. Let's assume for a minute that Zelensky said, negotiated an agreement with President Putin, which resulted in a so-called bad peace, sort of surrendering Donbass, whatever, Crimea, in return for security, protection, not joining NATO, etc. Let's assume that is put in place. That doesn't remove the likelihood of continued tensions in Central and Eastern Europe along the Russian border with NATO and with currently non-aligned countries like Sweden and Finland. So I don't want to be gloomy, but I think life has changed, so it's not going to be as global. Worldwide GDP growth rates are not going to be as great as they were before.
Yes.
And if you're running a business like we are trying to do, I think you have to be much more selective in terms of where you place your investments and where you place your emphasis. And that emphasis is going to determine how things play out from a geopolitical point of view. And just one other thing, whilst I think 2022 will continue to be a strongish year, that GDP will probably be up by something like, say, 3+%, which historically pre-COVID is a stronger pattern. When you get to 23, I think that's when the rubber hits the road, and you may be talking about 1.5, 2. And I think Goldman last weekend were talking about 25% or 1/3 probability of recession. Recession in Europe is probably more likely because of the impact of the war is much greater in the EU than it is globally or indeed in the US. So I think you have to look at it and be much more selective and think about the world in a different way to the way we've thought about it in the last 25, 30, 35 years. It's going to be much more fragmented. We'll see what happens on Sunday in France. The bet seems to be that Macron will retain his position, which I think generally will be good news. But we have to see what happens in America in 2024.
Let me bring you back to India, Martin. Let me bring you back to India. Given that, China is being blacklisted by large parts of the world as the world's manufacturing and sourcing hub. Do you think India has used the opportunity to claim that position, or do you think countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and maybe even Ethiopia have, been faster to attack?
Well, look, I don't. You said China blacklisted. I think that's probably it's not quite so. I think people are going to be more cautious about investment. I mean, China has a specific issue at the moment around lockdown and the next wave or another wave of COVID lockdowns and the impact on the Shanghai economy. You know, we have an significant operation for us in Shanghai, and that has been affected by the lockdowns. And that's, you see with some of the luxury Kering, I think, reported today or yesterday, significant impact of the Chinese slowdown or as a result of the lockdown. So I wouldn't say blacklisted, Sonali. I would say people are going to be more cautious because of the war, potential implications for Taiwan, etc. I think India has capitalized or will be capitalizing on that. I would say India has capitalized on the growing cost in China. Abstracting from the war situation, India for the last 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years has started to capitalize, I think, very successfully with tremendous human capital, particularly in the technology area, in terms of nearshoring and offshoring. But cost has become an issue, and rising costs, as in all these nearshore, offshore countries. I mean, ultimately, it's a question of supply and demand, and it starts to balance. I think that the reality is India will continue to benefit. Its scale, size, growth, leadership, branding strength, alternative opportunity, the extent to which is an alternative opportunity will work in its favor. But the other countries that you mentioned and the others that I mentioned will continue to benefit too. So there will be alternative competitors, if you like, to India for location. India, because of its scale and size, will be the third largest economy in a few years, offers huge opportunity. And, we, just talking from an S4 point of view, let alone previously from WPP or Saatchi point of view, we always saw India as a focal point for our activities, a focal point for talent, and a focal point really for distribution of that talent or enriching or using that talent to enrich operations outside India. So the diaspora, if you like, spreading throughout the world. So huge opportunity, but there will be competition. You mentioned a few of the countries. I mentioned a few of them. There will be significant competition. There will be a very competitive marketplace. But given the things that we've touched on in the first part of our conversation, probably the opportunities are greater now.
Martin, I'm going to share some of your doom and gloom. Do you think while world over leaders seem to portray, and even businesses seem to portray optimism about the future, is that optimism misplaced given the fact that governments across the world have given out major doleouts and there are severe repercussions to that in terms of the debt burden and in terms of the tax increases that will have to be implemented shortly? So are we looking at a doom and gloom period for the next few years before, of course, we see the buoyancy come back and see a boom period?
Well, Chair Powell said it, I think yesterday, on a CNBC. There I mentioned a competitive network on this, but on CNBC yesterday, the balancing act between controlling inflation and avoiding recession is going to be it's a tightrope. And, I think the fear maybe until yesterday, maybe there was a strong signal yesterday, was that the Fed was behind the curve. There is a worry that the ECB and Lagarde are behind the curve. President Lagarde said yesterday that she thought, that the inflation was, or the inflationary situation probably was greater in the US than it was in Europe, because the impact of the war in Europe would have a more significant effect on GDP. I mean, look, go back to Larry Summers and what he said. He is a democratic economist. and therefore probably better disposed to the Biden administration than most economists or many economists. And he said, a year or so ago, that the fiscal and monetary infusion would lead to significant inflation. And that has proven to be right. And what is he saying now is that the likelihood of recession is increasing. So that tightrope, or that balancing act, is really a very difficult one, Sonali. And my view would be being realistic. Look, we all like to be bullish about and be optimistic. It doesn't do our people any good to be pessimistic. But I think you have to be a bit realistic. GDP growth last year, just repeat, 5 to 6. This year, maybe we get to something over 3%. Next year, probably 1.5 to 2. And that was certainly down on where we were 3 months ago, because we would have expected 23 to probably be maybe 2.5, 3 or something like that. I think there are two drivers of our business at S4. One is GDP growth, and the other is digital transformation. And just listening to the ITC segment, it was really interesting to hear the CEO talking about agility, which is absolutely key. I mean, I would throw in things like first-party data and taking back control of your marketing as well. But it was really interesting to hear that, and the importance of digital transformation. So as GDP pressure intensifies in 23, what I would expect that the other driver of growth in our business, which continues to be a massive driver at the moment, will be digital transformation. The demand, this is where India can score. The demand for technological digital transformation will accelerate as GDP pressure increases. But you're right. I mean, the simple fact of the matter is we see here in the UK, taxes have risen. Boris Johnson is a so-called conservative prime minister, but he has moved the party to the centre where Blair and Brown occupied it when they were in power. You win elections in the centre, or you tend to win them in the centre. He's moved them to the centre, and the Tories now in Britain, well, we have the highest tax rates here that we've had for, I think it's 70 years. So it may be that as Boris gears up for an election in 2024 or 23, whenever it comes, there will be some giveaway. Rishi Sunak will give away tax reductions in order to stimulate the electorate. We'll see whether Boris leads the Tories into that election. We'll see over the next few months whether that's going to be the case or not. But it's a good little example of what's happening.
Sure.
The giveaway in 21, the COVID giveaway in 21, which, as I said, worldwide is something like 10 to 15 trillion, has to be paid for. And you're absolutely right. Balancing that is a really difficult act for governments. And I think to be responsible in running your business, you have to think about that too. You have to think about the pressures that are going to come as GDP growth slows.
Sure. Our last question. I'm completely pressed for time, Martin, but changing gears, I want your opinion about the possibility of the Elon Musk-owned Twitter and why that's causing such a stir with global advertisers. What are the repercussions if, Twitter does actually become Elon Musk's?
Well, look, I don't see it any different to Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post, or the rise of Rupert Murdoch, or William Randolph Hearst, or indeed Mark Benioff owning Time magazine. It's a trophy. I think Elon Musk, for him, it's a trophy property. He runs his business. There are about 200 million Twitter followers. 200 million.
He said clearly that he wants it to be editorially led and no ads. So,
well, let's get that. So, first of all, it's a trophy property. Secondly, it gives him access to 200 million people. I think he's selling 1 million cars this year. So, it just put that. So, from a business point of view, he says he doesn't spend anything on marketing, or people say he does spend a bit because he does launch events and the like. But, the average auto manufacturer spends probably about $1,000 a unit. It varies from a lower figure to up to $2,000. But he doesn't spend that much amount of marketing. His way of marketing and creating a brand has been very different. So you've got to think about it. His call for free speech, his libertarian position is another part of it. But I have to say, from a digital advertising point of view, Sonali, last year digital advertising was about 450 billion. Google did about 215. This year they'll do about 290 billion. Amazon did 31 last year, probably will do 40 this year. Facebook did 115 last year, probably do 130, 135 this year. In the Twitter only did about 3.5 billion.
Yeah.
Its total revenues were 5, advertising 3.5. If I was on the board of Twitter, and now Elon Musk has shown how he might finance his bid before it was conditional on finance, I would bite his hand off.
Fair enough. Thank you so much. I'm completely out of time. It's been absolutely spectacular speaking with you. I wish you were here in person, but I hope to see you soon in India.
I wish I was too, Sonali.
I hope to see you soon.
To see the IPL, and I wish the Mumbai Indians were doing a bit better.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Sonali. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you, Sir Sorrell, and thank you, Sonali.